holding a secret burial for the Putin critic without any mourners. Lyudmila Navalnaya says she's finally been allowed to see her son's body a week on from his death in prison.
I want you, to whom Alexei is dear, to have the opportunity to say goodbye to him. They started threatening me. Looking into my eyes, they say if I do not agree to a secret funeral, they will do something with my son's body.
The opposition leader's team says his death certificate cites natural causes. Moscow has denied any responsibility. The Foreign Office has imposed new sanctions on Russia just days before the second anniversary of the invasion of Ukraine. They target its military supply chains. The Scouts have been referred to police following the death of a 16-year-old boy on a trip in North Wales. They'd already apologised after Ben Leonard fell from a cliff. A coroner says the Scout Association should be investigated for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. A minister's admitted some genuine criminals could be exonerated under plans to resolve the post office scandal, but says it is a price worth paying. Criteria has been set out for government legislation that will automatically clear the names of convicted sub-postmasters. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 22 points at 76.84. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17.
LBC Weather.
With Ripple Energy. Climate action you can be proud of.
Scattered showers in the north and west tonight. Snow possible on the hills in Wales, northwest England and Scotland, and a low of -1. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Very good evening. 3 minutes past 8 is the time on LBC. It's Iain Dale here with you until 10. Now, a lot of people have said over the last 24 hours, oh my goodness, the flim-flammery of Westminster, it means absolutely nothing. Well, I'll tell you what, the next hour is going to mean something because we're going to get our teeth into a very meaty subject, and that is defence. I want to talk about NATO. I want to talk about Ukraine. I want to talk about the future of British defence policy. I want to talk about the future of NATO. And the reason that we're doing this is because we have with us Peter Apps, who's a journalist and British Army reservist. He's the author of a new book, Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO. And I think it's going to serve a really useful purpose because I've become increasingly convinced that defence policy is going to dominate the next 10 or 20 years of our politics in a way that it certainly hasn't over the last 20. When I was a teenager and in my 20s, defence policy was a really important thing. And we had the Falklands War, we had the Cold War. And ever since the end of the Cold War, I think we've kind of taken our eye off the ball. And we almost see defence spending as a bit of a luxury. Well, no longer, because 2 years ago, in 2 days' time, that's the anniversary of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And it's something that I think many of us thought we would hopefully never see in our lifetime, a European country invading another European country with all sorts of consequences, not just in defence terms, but also in economic terms too, because we all know that one of the main reasons that our fuel bills have gone through the roof is because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So attention is starting to shift now to, well, what should we be doing over the next 10 or 20 years to not just protect our country, but also protect all the other members of NATO. Because although Vladimir Putin maintains that he would never, ever even think about invading Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Finland, Sweden, people in those countries don't believe a word of it. They're all members of NATO. Sweden and Finland joined NATO in the last 18 months or so. And they clearly fear that Russia has ill intentions towards them. Now, I hope those fears are ill-founded. But instead of spending what we've been spending on defence, I suspect defence spending has got to increase dramatically. But is that something that voters are going to really buy into? I want to hear from you over the next hour on all of those issues. 0345 6060 973. That's the number to call. Well, Peter, welcome to the programme. Tell us why you wanted to write about the history of NATO, because people say it's a bit of a dry subject to write about.
Well, I mean, firstly, it was a really good prism to look at how we got from 1945 to the present. So, you know, the idea came after the invasion of Ukraine, as you say, the return of proper old-fashioned, massed firepower, massed population warfare in Europe. And the story of NATO, really is the story of how we avoided that during the Cold War. The creation of NATO between 1945 and 1949 really was the story of tying together Europe and the United States, ending American isolationism, then building up those kind of defences. You talked about those tough choices about defence spending. Dwight D. Eisenhower was NATO's first Supreme Allied Commander from 1951, 1952. And he really wrestled with that issue because he realised quite early on that we could do what the Soviets did. We could put a huge chunk of our GDP into defence over a 25, 30, 40-year period, but then we wouldn't be able to rebuild. And striking that balance between rebuilding Europe in the way we did from 1945 through to the 70s, 80s, 90s, and having enough defence, both nuclear and conventional, was really something that we struggled with throughout the Cold War. Cold War ended, that vanished. Balkans, Afghanistan, and then you're on an express elevator ride back to the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So it's a doorstep of a book, but the chapters are quite short, and there's a lot of history crammed into it.
So it's very, very readable. And I suppose my first encounter with NATO, if I can call it that, was when I used to do debates in the 1980s on why NATO was right and CND were wrong. And it's developed as an organisation in a very sort of different way since then, hasn't it? It's still got the same objectives, but the threats are different.
Well, it depends. It depends on when you compare things too, because actually, if you sit in Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe today in Mons, or you're in Estonia today, and I was there just last week, it feels pretty like Europe in 1951. You've got a very large rearming Russian/Soviet state that has clearly got ambitions towards its neighbours. You've got a very real possibility of conflict, and you've got rising tensions. If you think back to the early 1950s, you had those sort of 11 years of rising tensions, 12 years through the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, and we really are back in that kind of environment now. But yes, that feels hugely different to when I was a first reservist around 1999, 2001, where we thought conflict was something that happened in dusty places half a world away. We're a very long way away from where we were even a decade ago when it comes to NATO. So it's going back to its roots. But of course, there's pretty much no one alive these days who remembers those roots.
If we look at the situation in Europe at the moment, and there's a clear and obvious threat from Russia, I remember 2 years ago, literally the week before Putin invaded, talking to Mary Dejevsky, who had been Moscow correspondent for The Independent, and she was absolutely adamant that Putin he's not stupid, he wouldn't do that. And that seemed to be the consensus among most defence so-called experts, and they were all proved completely wrong. And I can remember back in November 2021, looking at all the sort of the reports of the troop movements and the fact that they were building sort of hospitals sort of on the border, and you think, well, they wouldn't do that for an exercise, would they? And I came to the conclusion way before that Putin did intend to invade. And I'm thinking, well, I'm not a defence expert. I like to think I know a little bit, but I'm not an expert. Why did all the experts get that wrong?
Well, I think to be fair to those who questioned the invasion, I think there were two separate things going on that are quite understandable with hindsight. The first is that Zelensky in Ukraine was talking down the prospect of invasion right up until the very last minute. And there were a variety of quite good reasons for doing that, not least to try and keep the Ukrainian economy afloat, trying to stop sort of mass flight of capital and other things. He'd actually been told, we know with hindsight, that that by the Americans that invasion was likely several months earlier. But I think you can understand why he wasn't talking that up. And the second is Iraq. So there was, in the North Atlantic Council, there was a very considerable constituency of opinion, voiced particularly vocally by the French, but also other people, that, the Americans have got this very badly wrong before, and that they might therefore have got it wrong again. And the simple truth is that I think quite a few people thought that Putin was bluffed to the limit and then pulled back. And it was only in the last sort of week or so that people really realised that, that really wasn't going to happen and we really were going over the edge.
So let's try and look to the future a little bit, because I do want to get people on the air to ask you some questions. We've already got several phoning in. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to talk to Peter. Do you agree with me that we're going to have a really big, intensive debate about our defence policy, and in the end, it's going to, whatever we decide, we're going to have to spend a lot more money on it.
Yeah, so I think there's two things going on here. Firstly, there's the West is going to have a serious discussion about defence. NATO is going to have a serious discussion about defence. What the Americans do, we've talked about Trump a bit already, is going to be hugely important. And then the question is what role Britain wishes to play in that. To what extent do we wish to prioritise the defence of Europe? Traditionally, over the last 20, 30 years, we've tried to do bits of stuff all over the world. We don't necessarily treat NATO as our core task. We treat it as one of them. You still hear people, defence ministers, chiefs of defence staff talking about sending a submarine to Taiwan, doing stuff in the Middle East. How important is Europe in that greater scale of things? The Americans have quite a strong opinion on that. They think we should do more in Europe. How much do we want to follow European powers who maybe are thinking of reintroducing conscription? How do we want to engage with Europe? And of course, what does Europe look like? Because that will depend on what we've got to engage with.
How live a debate is that in other European countries about conscription? Because, I can just imagine Grant Shapps standing up at the dispatch box and announcing that in this country. There would almost be a revolution, wouldn't there?
Yes, in the Baltic states, it's a done deal. In the Nordic states that have got to have a tradition of this, it's coming back. The Poles, interestingly enough, it's surprisingly unpopular in Poland. The Poles are really struggling with what they do about conscription. It's a much liver debate in Germany. Elsewhere, it's quite unpopular. But
Germany had conscription until comparatively recently.
Germany did, as did France. The other thing that's really interesting, one of the think tanks called the Friends of Europe in Brussels did some really good focus groups with young Europeans. And young Europeans, by and large, are a lot more open to being conscripted by the European Union than they are by their respective countries. Now, that's a very different Europe to the one we thought we were engaging with. And that obviously would put Britain, there's a whole bunch of questions about how Britain could engage with that. And I don't think, intellectually or otherwise, we've really started to mention that. The nuclear deterrent is the other point. The French have a nuclear deterrent. We have a nuclear deterrent. They are, between them, the two nuclear deterrents in Europe. Would the EU want to get its own nuclear deterrent to be the French? How would we interact? There's a whole bunch of really quite interesting conversations. And I don't, to be honest, think that we have quite really begun to engage with what those questions would be. So yes, probably spending more on defence, but how you do that is really a bunch of really live questions.
Because it's quite difficult to persuade people who think the NHS is underfunded, that education is underfunded, that the police are underfunded, that money should be taken from those budgets to put into defence. Yeah,
and to an extent, if your society collapses at one end, you don't have effective defence. It all comes out of the same pot. There's a reason why the Labour government that built NATO in 1945 also built the welfare state. Right, that was a whole part of building a social contract after the Second World War. It was a whole part of building that social contract that kept communism out. So these are really quite complicated questions.
One of the other things that people say, and they say it often on this programme, that NATO is not a defensive alliance. Do you address that in the book?
Yeah, I think, again, it really depends where you're coming from, right? So, the Estonians in particular, Kaja Kallas, their prime minister, is pretty upfront and borderline sort of undiplomatic in that invading countries is bad and NATO should exist to stop it. Now, that is an implicit criticism of the invasion of Iraq in 2004. Now, ironically, the Baltic states got into NATO because they did a deal with the Bush administration to support the invasion of Iraq. But I think there is an opinion, it's certainly in the areas where people can imagine themselves being invaded, that invasions are a bad idea and they should be stopped. You're right. In Kosovo and Libya, there's no question that NATO intervened. It also intervened in Bosnia, but in Bosnia it did so as a subcontractor for the UN, which is unquestionably fine under the UN Charter. The other two were a lot dodgier. The intervention in Afghanistan is different because NATO came in after the 5 years after the Taliban were toppled. But again, George Robertson, former Secretary General, admitted it wasn't their finest hour. A very long-running campaign that obviously ended in complete disaster. So yeah, there's the NATO that fundamentally I tell the story of is the one that defends Europe. But yes, there's quite a lot of bits in it where it goes off and does other things, and by and large, those are not always as successful.
Right, lots more to talk about, and we'll come to your calls, 0345 6060 973. If you'd like to talk to us about any aspect of UK defence policy, any aspect of NATO, particularly if you've got questions about the way NATO operates. Since the Russians invaded Ukraine, of course, a lot of people have rung in and said, it's all NATO's fault, because NATO's been expanding into Eastern Europe and therefore Putin doesn't approve of that. So you can't really blame him, can you, Ian? That's what people say. I give a pretty robust response to that, but let's see what Peter thinks of that kind of argument. 0345 6060 973. You're listening to LBC. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:15.
This is LBC.
State on LBC. Welcome if you've just joined us. We're in the company of Peter Apps, a journalist and British Army reservist. He's the author of a new book, Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO, which has got a fantastic... Well, the cover makes... Whatever you think of sort of the subject matter, the cover actually makes you want to buy the book. But I haven't because I've got a free one, but I feel I ought to. Peter, let's continue what we were talking about just before the break there. People describe NATO as not a defensive alliance, but as being rather expansionist. How fair is that?
Well, so there's only one way in which countries can join NATO, which is that they ask to join. Every country that's joined NATO, with the exception of Portugal in 1949, which was still a dictatorship, has been a democracy. And to be really blunt, the US in particular has usually tried quite hard to stop those countries joining in a hurry. So if you go back to the 1990s, the US was extremely lukewarm on the Baltic states and Poland joining, and it was only a really concerted effort by those countries that got them into the alliance in general. Also, the US was extremely cautious on Ukraine getting independence. George Bush Sr. gave a speech in Kiev in 1991 that was so negative on independence. It was dubbed the Chicken Kiev. So I mean, I think this idea that NATO is something that keeps on trying to get larger is simply broadly wrong. By and large, countries want to get into NATO, and countries want to get into NATO, to quote one Baltic official, because it's the only guarantee that you don't wake up in the morning getting with a knock on your door and being deported to Siberia, which is particularly how the population of the Baltic states see it, who were, of course, independent countries after the First World War, absorbed into the Soviet Union in 1945, and they didn't get out until 1991.
Because there was talk in the 1990s of Russia joining NATO, wasn't there?
So, yeah, from the very sort of start of the end of the Cold War, there were suggestions, particularly under the Yeltsin government, that Russia wanted to join. And Yeltsin was very clear that he wanted to join first, so before Poland, before the Baltic states. And this was sort of bounced around for about 5 or 6 years, and eventually the German defence minister — Germany is a lot more important in the history of NATO than I think people usually give it credit for, certainly all that I'd realised before I started writing the book. But the German defence minister Volker Ruh finally sort of said, I think Russia in NATO is never going to work, and we shouldn't pretend it is. And the reason that no one wanted Russia in NATO was incredibly simple. It would have given it a veto on everything, which would have meant that its ability to protect the members who were worried about Russia, which, and don't forget, Germany would be included in that, particularly once it absorbed East Germany. There's no question that Germany and the countries east of it were never going to let Russia into NATO, because what they were worried about was Russia, and it would therefore make no sense to allow it into the alliance.
Right, let's go to a call. Elias is in High Wycombe. Elias, hi.
I'd like to say that this NATO thing regarding America doesn't listen to NATO anyway. They do what they want and hope that NATO would support them when they decide to do things. And if I can make a comment on this war in Ukraine, this war in Ukraine is actually all about having an air base on Russia's border. You could wrap it up in so many different ways, but that's actually why we're here where we are today.
Well, where we are today because Russia invaded Ukraine. That's what it wasn't. It wasn't the Americans trying to sort of build an airbase in Ukraine. It was because Russia invaded.
No, Russia obviously invaded Ukraine, but the reason why is kind of before they kind of was pushed into it in a funny kind of way.
Okay.
Well, yes, because the West was sanctioning them, blaming Putin for everything, said you're going to do this, do that. Obviously, Putin started the war, but it's the reason behind it. You can't just jump and say, well, Putin invaded. You've got to take a step back and say, well, if he did invade it, why did he do it? The reason is why he done it was simply because America wanted to put a base, a NATO or an American base and a NATO base there. Donald Trump, everyone knows he's a bit of a clown, okay? But he said if he wins the president, he could probably stop this war within a day. And the only reason he could probably think like that is because he would say to Putin, I'll give you my word, I would not have an air base or NATO base on your border. America wouldn't want it. If the shoe was on the other foot and Russia teamed up with Mexico and they're going to put an air base on the border of Mexico and America is going to be exactly the same. They're not going to let it happen.
All right. Okay, well, let me let Peter address your points because I might lose my temper if I do.
So, I think there is no doubt that one of the reasons that Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine was he thought he was on the edge of permanently losing Ukraine to the West. There's no doubt that not just Putin, but a bunch of other people in the Kremlin believe that certainly large chunks, and he was very clear on this with the interview with Tucker Carlson, that Russia essentially sort of has rights over Ukraine which would exceed that which a democratic Ukraine would like to have. And there's also no question that by 2020, 2021, Ukraine was much more closely aligned with the West militarily. Now, that doesn't extend to having a US base there. I don't actually think the US would have put a base there, but that doesn't mean Putin didn't think he was losing it, and that certainly helped drive his decision-making. Now, I think that's probably not viewed by most people as being a justification for invading a country, but it probably did drive it. Your earlier point that the US doesn't do what NATO says is you're broadly right. NATO is a club of nations which is inherently or for most of its history, and I think this is potentially about to change, has been less powerful than its most powerful member. So, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, during the building of the Berlin Wall, the US called the shots and other NATO countries decided what they were going to do, but didn't have a lot of choice but to follow on from that. I think one of the things that is interesting is that we are about to go into an era where that might not be the case. So where the US, Trump, Biden, doesn't matter. So, I think, again, we should probably be looking beyond Trump and Biden, who've only got probably another one term on them, into the 2030s. The US is going to be much more focused on Asia. Europe is not going to be its priority in the way that it was after 1945. And that means that actually the nations of NATO, which are more important than NATO itself and always will be, so, France, Britain, Germany, inherently have more power than the NATO Secretary General, who is just the person who chairs a committee and tries to keep all this together, are going to have to make decisions between them on how they defend defend the continent, and a chunk of that will be driven by them. A chunk will be driven by the countries that feel most scared because they are the most incentivized to do stuff, and a chunk of it will be driven by whatever Putin or whoever succeeds him thinks. Is the Kremlin prepared to cede control of the Baltic states forever? It probably doesn't have a choice. If it wants to get control back over the Baltic states, it's probably going to have to fight NATO. Those are choices, and those choices are going to dictate the future. As is, we haven't mentioned this at all, whether China invades Taiwan, which is the one thing that could easily push Europe over the edge, because you could easily see the Russians come into Europe at the same time as the Chinese invasion of Taiwan.
All of which points to the fact that every single member of NATO needs to really think about, what if America does take a different stance over the next 10 years and its attention is diverted to Asia rather than Europe? How are we, as the European members of NATO, going to react to that? How much more money is it going to cost? Because Trump rightly, in his first term, challenged NATO members to get to the 2%. More of them, I think it's now half have done so, isn't it?
It's now 20 something out of 30, so it's about 2/3. Europe is now spending 2% of its total GDP on defence, which is a very significant uptick on where we were in 2014. And I think what's more important is that in the last year, when people have, Russia has massively ramped up its own defence spending in the last year.
Well, they're spending 40% of their GDP on defence.
Estimates vary, but it's certainly a very large amount. And that's where you had Boris Pistorius, German defence minister, was talking about potentially lifting to maybe 3.5. 3.5% of German GDP without a nuclear programme is a hell of a lot of money.
Yeah.
If you bear in mind a large chunk of British defence spending goes on that nuclear deterrent. If Germany was to decide not to have a nuclear deterrent and to invest 3.5% of GDP in defence, again, bear in mind it's also a lot closer to where any front line would be. That is a really large amount of money.
Let's go to Danny in Lincoln. Danny, good evening.
Good evening. I'm Estonian. Well, from Estonia, but my dad is Russian and my mom is Ukrainian. I have family in Russia and Ukraine. I have 2 houses in Ukraine that are now Russia. And I sort of feel where Putin gets his power from in invading Ukraine. What helped and what could help in Baltic states. So to prevent it, I think it is the division where Russians and Russian descendants are treated like wanted, in those countries. And I think what will help is programs where they integrate people into society better, like integration programs.
As an Estonian, Danny, do you fear that Russia might decide to invade Estonia?
Well, not fear. Well, to me, if it happens, it happens. I don't really fear Russia coming in. And most of my friends that are also Russians who were born in Estonia. When I was born in Estonia, I've been given a grey passport, and in the graph of citizenship is stated alien, which means basically unwanted. So there's inherent division, and still up to this day. I remember last time I've been there, they had 2 separate bus stops, a red one and the blue one. And the red one said, Russians stand here, and the blue one said, Estonians stand here.
So, I can pick up on some of this. I think probably a lot of listeners won't realise, but there were a very significant proportion of Russian speakers who were left in the Baltic states when they got independence in 1991. And they're spread across the Baltic states, but they're particularly in Estonia. And it's about 1/3 of the population by some people's measures. Now, some of those are Estonians with Estonian passports. Some of them, as our caller just said, have alien passports, and some of them are Russian citizens. So there's quite a large number of Russian speakers in a variety of positions. And you're right, their position feels quite uncomfortable. It's not dissimilar to the position in eastern Ukraine. One of the things that successive governments in Estonia also have wrestled with, and this is one of the things that could become potentially a bit of a flashpoint in Eastern Europe is that you do have, particularly in Estonia, there's a town called Narva just on the Russian border. It's got a population of about 50,000. They're predominantly Russian-speaking. It is probably the most likely place the Russians would grab if they were going to make a land grab against NATO, very like places like Donetsk and so forth in eastern Ukraine. I was there about 5 years ago, and the population there hold a variety of different views, and they're not always honest about those views. So there are a bunch of people who quietly or not so quietly believe that Putin is a Russian nationalist who has the same views as them. There are a bunch of people who believe they'd rather stay in democratic Estonia and the EU, particularly because they can work in Germany and Finland. And there are a bunch of people who, as your caller said, if it happens, it happens. Who would like to go on living where they want to live, would really like there not to be a war. But if there is, will try and make whatever kind of deals they have to try and make life work. And I think what NATO is trying to do, and NATO allies are trying to do, is firstly, fundamentally, it's down to the governments of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as to how they manage that. Now, that's a very complicated issue. Estonia is at the moment trying to combine Russian-speaking and Estonian-speaking schools in a way that is quite controversial, and I don't want time to get into here, but you can see why Russian speakers might not like some of what's going on there. You can see why the Estonians might be worried. They've just seen what's happened in Ukraine, the idea of NATO is to have a enough credible force that as to quote Martin Heron, the outgoing Estonian defence chief, that Russia will get punched on the nose if it tries to take Narva or Tallinn, and that NATO will fight for Narva and Tallinn with the same degree of kind of ferocity. Now, all of those are really quite complicated things, but they give you an idea of just how messy a confrontation in Eastern Europe might be, and how much more vulnerable it would be if the one thing that stopped that happening, which is a United States which is determined to defend Eastern Europe, what Joe Biden called a sacred obligation at the time of the invasion of Ukraine, gets called into question. Biden was really clear in February of 2022 that he wasn't going to defend Ukraine, and he was going to defend NATO territory. If that starts to get diluted, then things get a bit more complicated.
Absolutely fascinating. Peter's book is called Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO. We've got another half an hour with him. Lots of calls coming in, so we'll get to as many of your calls as possible. It's 8:32 news headlines on LBC with Daryl Jackson.
Rishi Sunak's criticised the Speaker's handling of yesterday's chaotic Commons debate on Gaza as concerning as calls grow for him to step down. But Sir Lindsay Hoyle's defended his decisions, telling the House he's only guilty of looking after members. The mother of Russia's opposition leader Alexei Navalny says she's finally seen his body a week on from his death. But she claims officials are trying to blackmail her into holding a private burial. And details of legislation to exonerate sub-postmasters in the Horizon scandal have been set out by the government. Post Office Minister Kevin Hollinrake says long overdue justice will be delivered to workers wrongly convicted of theft and fraud. LBC weather: scattered showers in the north and west tonight. Snow possible on the hills in Wales, northwest England and Scotland, and a low of -1.
LBC
Mark Rutte, the former Dutch Prime Minister, he's tipped to be the next NATO Secretary General. Would he be a good choice?
Well, I mean, I think...
He's known as the Trump Whisperer, apparently.
No, Jens Stoltenberg was known as the Trump Whisperer.
Oh, right. Sorry to tell you.
We're just coming to the end. Again, most listeners will probably be sort of familiar with the sight and sound of Jens Stoltenberg, former Norwegian Prime Minister. He's been Secretary General of NATO since 2014. He is very likely to finally stand down, and there's been the sort of parlour game of who's going to replace him. It's quite a difficult job being NATO Secretary General. You've got to keep a US president on side, you've got to manage a whole bunch of Europeans, and you've got to deal with a bunch of people who think Russia is a great threat and lots of things need to be sorted out and need to be done to stop that, and a bunch of other countries that think that not upsetting Russia is really important. And that's one of the reasons why they tend to go for sort of Scandinavians or Northern Europeans, because Eastern and Central Europeans are seen as too hawkish, so some others are seen as too dovish, so you go for someone in the middle. And Mark Rutte is highly respected. He's been at the top table of European politics for a very long time. He already knows everybody. And he's been around for long enough. So, to be totally honest, one of the reasons that Stoltenberg didn't stand down this time round is that people have been waiting for Rutte to lose an election for a while. And now he's lost an election, of course, he's free and he's in the wind, which means he can be offered the job. Because there aren't really that many people who can be offered it. The French and the Germans in particular were very clear that they wanted an EU member, particularly in the event of a US departure. It was felt the Brits would not be a good choice for that, which is why Ben Wallace didn't get it. So there aren't that many choices, and Rutte has been on the list for a long time, and he's just become free at the right point.
Right, let's go back to your calls. Mario is in Turnford in Hertfordshire. Hello, Mario.
Hello, Ian. Hello, Peter. When the war started 2 years ago, you might recall that Putin sort of showed his teeth a little bit. He said to NATO, back off. We're a powerful state and we've got nuclear weapons. He didn't really say, but he sort of implied it. And there was all this talk afterwards about battlefield nuclear weapons. And it sort of scared all of us, didn't it? It sort of scared me a little bit. And I'm sort of wondering now, actually, if there was a war, say Russia did try something against Estonia, would it necessarily lead to a nuclear war? Could it be a more localized battle that might last a few weeks and then we come to our senses?
I mean, it could last a few weeks, it could last a lot longer. I think one of the things that has become clear from the war in Ukraine is that it's not impossible to imagine a war taking place in, say, the Baltic states and Eastern Europe that lasts for years. Now, that's really different to the sort of war that we were praying for during the Cold War, where the Americans only had a month's supply of artillery in Europe. One of the reasons why you're seeing really massive increases, so Britain is increasing its artillery production capacity 8-fold, and doing it very, very fast. So BAE Systems will from almost no starting capacity, will be most of the way to that total by the end of the year. Now, we're doing that to reinforce the Ukrainians, who have used up pretty much the entire Western Alliance's supply of artillery and rockets in the space of 2 years, but also to rebuild those stockpiles in NATO countries so that if necessary we could fight for quite a long time. There's pretty much no limit to the number of things that might happen, to be honest. The Russians could make a move at some point and detonate a tactical nuclear weapon, for example, over their own territory, to just scare people and demonstrate they've got them. They could fire one at a ship. The number of things that could happen is frankly quite enormous. But I think one of the ways in which this new Cold War, if you want to call it that, or whatever you want to call the confrontation now with Russia and China, is very different to the first one, is there is no longer an assumption that a conventional war will turn nuclear in the first week or so. It could easily carry on for quite a long time. And that would still be incredibly dangerous. So I think, we could be seeing a variety of situations over the next 20 or so years. And, there are brighter people than me in the Pentagon and MOD and think tanks and so forth thinking through these scenarios, but there are an awful lot of them.
One of the things that I think has been very interesting... Sorry, I'll come back to you in a minute, Mario, just while I think of this point that I want to make. Yeah, the Ukraine war has proved that conventional warfare is not old-fashioned. I mean, I think most people have were thinking, well, of course, that if there is another European war, it wouldn't be based on traditional soldier combat, would it? It would be much more high-tech than that. But I think Ukraine has proved that it could well be.
Well, so I think it's both. I mean, a bit like the First World War was a rethinking of the American Civil War with new tech. Several things are new about this war. It's the first war ever between depopulating countries, right? So both Russia and Ukraine have shrinking populations. It's the first war to take place on the edge of the AI era. So AI is now a very different place to where it was even at the time of the invasion, and that's been really important for things like intelligence. Drones are coming of age. So the Russians just put a bounty on capturing the first Estonian robot in Ukraine, because the Estonians have had some of the Estonian unmanned systems are operating live with weapons on them, doing things like casualty evacuation and reconnaissance in Ukraine. I think if we fast forward even a year or two, if the Ukraine war is still going on, you'll be seeing robot artillery on the battlefield in a way that you don't currently see. If you're in it, it basically feels like being in the trenches of the Battle of the Somme or Ypres, except that now you've got a drone, except you're now much more concerned about your battery life for all the systems that you've got with you. You're much more concerned about your electronic signature, because if you take your smartphone with you, you get caught and killed. So there's a whole bunch of nasty new postmodern twists on it. But you're cold, you're tired, and everyone's older. Average age of a Ukrainian conscript is 42. Compared to sort of the early 20s in the trenches of the 1917. I'm 42 years old and I am younger than the average Ukrainian combatant. That's a pretty strange feeling, and that suggests that the world is heading into kind of slightly sort of both familiar territory, but also very new territory.
Mario, you wanted to come back.
Well, I'm 50, and if they do call me up, I want to go into the catering call, to be honest with you.
If I get called up at the age of 61, we really would be in desperate straits.
I wanted to ask, is there a perceived weakness with NATO on a particular part of the border with Russia? So, for example, I think there's an area, I think it's where, that Russian enclave is?
Kaliningrad, yeah.
Yeah, and they could sort of cut us off between Poland and the Baltic states. Is that right?
Yeah, so essentially, if you think about Belarus juts into the heart of Europe, like I said, a dagger points into Poland, and Kaliningrad is a Russian enclave on the coast of Lithuania. So yes, if you were to punch through from Belarus to Lithuania, you would cut the main road into the Baltic states, and you would therefore make it a lot harder to resupply us. And that's particularly important to us because the Brits command the battle group in Estonia. So we are the furthest eastern battle group on that road. Now, a whole bunch of stuff's been done to make the Suwalki Gap a lot less easy to digest, not least that the Germans are tripling the size of their force there to a full brigade, and the Americans also have a battle group in Poland. Now, that means that if you're going to force your way through from Belarus to Kaliningrad, and I realise I should be pointing at a map at this point, you would have to fight your way through a very large number of German and American troops. That's probably enough to harden the Suwalki Gap. That means that we're back where our friend was talking about earlier. Where's the weak point on the front? It's probably Estonia. What have you got in Estonia? You've got a British battle group. The Canadians are tripling their force in Latvia to a brigade. The Lithuanians are tripling, the Germans are tripling their force in Lithuania to a brigade. If we're not careful, Rishi Sunak did not do the same with the British force in Vilnius in July. If we're not careful, we're making Estonia the weak point, and that's where they'll come. But I mean, essentially, they'll come where it looks weakest. And at the moment, it comes back to British defence policy, because we are not able to or not choosing to triple our force in Estonia, we risk making that the more easily digestible bit. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. It's entirely fascinating. And we're now at 8:45, and I'm thinking, I really wish we could do this for another hour and a quarter, but we can't. But we've got 15 more minutes with Peter Apps. His book is called Deterring Armageddon, a Biography of NATO. It's 8:45.
LBC
is the time. Peter Apps is here, the author of Deterring Armageddon, a biography of NATO. Lynn says, I think we should ditch Trident as we'll never use it, even if a nuclear bomb were to be dropped on us, and use the money to strengthen conventional forces. Am I being naive?
I don't think you're being naive. I mean, I think this has been the discussion in British defence policy ever since 1945, and there aren't any easy answers. The Americans have at various points tried to persuade us to get rid of our nuclear deterrent. The Kennedy administration did it, the Obama administration did it, and various ones in the middle, because they have felt that we didn't need it and that we should put our money into conventional forces because we can't do both very well. Now, the flip side to that is that we're about to have Trump we might be about to have Trump as US president, in which case we might lose the US nuclear umbrella over Europe, in which case everyone in Europe will be extremely relieved that the Brits and the French have a nuclear deterrent. So I think you're not being naive. Trident isn't necessarily the only way of doing nuclear weapons, although it's certainly the most survivable. I think the issue is that if you're going to get rid of the British nuclear deterrent, in the absence of a larger European deterrent, then you're taking a bet on the United States, and you're also taking a bet on our relations with the rest of Europe. Ever since 1945, ever since the Labour government of the 1940s, which started work on Britain's nuclear programme, the feeling has been to avoid another 1940 moment, we need to have a nuclear deterrent. But you're right, the money we put into that is money that we can't put into conventional forces. And as we know, Trident is both expensive and quite hard to keep working.
Right, Tony is in Fareham. Hello, Tony.
Yes, hello, Ian. Good evening, sir. Hello, Peter. My question is, in your opinion, what will happen to the Five Eyes should Donald Trump become president and the US pull away from NATO and Europe? Obviously, high-level intelligence, highly sensitive stuff. How will that be addressed?
So I think the Five Eyes remain important, not least because assuming that Trump doesn't wish to tear up all his alliances and the US remains focused on China, then the Australia and New Zealand element of the Five Eyes will be incredibly important to the Americans. And the second area in which Five Eyes is important beyond intelligence is space. As cyber to a certain extent, but particularly space. So as space becomes more important, there's a whole bunch of cooperations between the New Zealanders, the Australians, us and the Americans about how we sort of track and manage low Earth orbit that are really important. So I think that they will remain important. I think it depends how acrimonious things become between Trump and NATO, because that could put Britain in quite a complicated position. But the truth is, the Five Eyes relationship is probably pretty solid.
Just explain exactly what that is.
So the Five Eyes relationship is between what you might call the five sort of Anglo-Saxon. So the US, Australia, New Zealand, Britain, and Canada, who share intelligence in a way that goes well beyond any other intelligence sharing relationship, goes beyond our relationship with the French, the Germans, or anybody else. Quite a lot of highly classified material in all of those countries is shared between people who hold security clearances in all of those places. So that it's the closest cooperation that any countries really have. It is probably more durable than any individual US president. If you had a series of isolationist US presidents who wanted to tear it up, they could probably tear it up. If the US broke up, or all kinds of more extreme examples over the next 25, 30 years, then it could break down. But it is very powerful and it's very institutional. And those institutions, what people sometimes refer to as the deep state, do go beyond any individual governments in those countries.
Tony, thank you very much. Let's move on to Glenn in Farnborough. Hello, Glenn.
Hello, how you doing? So I'm British. My wife is Russian, and her family, the majority, are living in the eastern part of Latvia. Now, obviously, after the war, so all over everything has gone a bit crazy in the world, and Latvia has, in the meantime, destroyed statues of war heroes, etc. And among that, now they've taken away, as such, the Russian pension for the elderly population. So anybody who is like a Russian citizen living in Latvia kind of got a half pension from Latvia, half from Russia, and that Russian pension is now getting cut away from them due to sanctions. So do you think that Russia would, one, use this as a basis to go into Latvia? And do you think that Latvia being in NATO is going to stop Russia from coming over the border as such to help its citizens, as it kind of used an excuse for the beginning of Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the questions of the 21st century. I think it's important to remember that so these various statues. This is an issue in Estonia, it's an issue in Latvia, it's an issue in Lithuania, it's an issue to a certain extent in Poland. Different populations view those statues incredibly differently. In Poland, they're referred to as the statue of the unknown rapist. They were viewed as a symbol of Soviet domination. But if you are, as you say, as your wife's family is a Russian, then those are statues to your grandparents, great grandparents who died fighting Hitler, and those are viewed in a very visceral way. Now, there's no doubt that in the Baltic states, particularly in the last since the invasion of Ukraine, there's been a lot of destroying of their statues. Again, the Estonians have got rid of one in Narva, a Russian tank, and that has been taken very badly by the Russian-speaking population. Now, as to whether a future Russian government under Putin or someone else uses that as a pretext to attack, will primarily depend on whether they think they can get away with it, and that brings us back to the same sort of questions we've been mounting to before. But yes, I mean, I think. How those things pan out over the next 25 or 30 years will be questions that will feel like they determine how many of our lives. This is the Soviet missiles in Cuba, future of Berlin in the 1960s. These are exactly the sort of questions that will determine the kind of years to come.
Do you agree with the head of the British Army who said recently in a speech that he thought we were now part of a pre-war generation?
I mean, I think. Well, we're not. We're too old. But yeah, I mean, I think there is no doubt that we are in what could be quite a long. I was just in Taiwan. The Taiwanese think that this war isn't going to come until the 2030s. They think the Chinese will take longer to reconstitute their military.
I've got a friend though who seems completely unbothered by it all.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But I mean, there's whereas in Estonia they think this could happen next year. Or at least some people do. There is no doubt a feeling that we are moving into a particularly dangerous era. I know certainly that General Sanders' intervention got teenage kids talking at school. Yeah, am I going to be conscripted? Yeah. It's a very live conversation in most of Eastern Europe. I think there's an awareness that peace isn't something to be taken for granted. Some of this is being quite deliberately fed. One of the reasons why General Sanders said that is there's been a meeting of the NATO military committee the week before in Brussels, where Admiral Bauer, the chair of the military committee, had explicitly encouraged defence chiefs to go back to their countries and have these conversations about conscription, about a whole of society effort, those tough choices, health, welfare, there's we have to have these conversations because we are moving into this era.
But we're not having them, are we? That's the problem. I mean, okay, we're talking about it now, but I don't hear a great sort of interest in the wider media of talking about this. I don't hear a huge amount of interest among politicians talking about it as well. But if we don't, we're going to regret it.
Well, I mean, don't forget we are, this is Britain. We're a very long way away from the problem. It's a lot more of a live discussion point in Germany. If you want to know why the Europeans take defence more seriously than we do, it's because they're closer to Russia. It's not rocket science. When the facts change, they will change their mind. The facts have changed very abruptly, and certainly in the case of Germany, they are in the process of changing their minds. I think how we do that here is going to determine. There's a whole bunch of conversations. I mean, I think how we interact with the world is a question. I'm not sure that last night's sort of House of Commons thing on Gaza suggests that we necessarily interact with it terribly sensibly.
No,
but I think we do need to sort of think about these things.
We have 90 seconds left, and I don't know whether to go to Ozzy and Enfield or not. Oh, why not? Ozzy, what's your question, please, very briefly?
Yeah, good evening. I'm just wondering whether your guest is aware of the thoughts of Professor John Mearsheimer from America, who has some views around how this all came about and suggests this has been going on for 10 years. Ukraine is not as a simple situation as we all thought. It's a split country, has been since 2014, and he lists all sorts of things that that we could have done to avoid all of this. I mean, as the early noughties, Bill Burns wrote a an email to Washington saying "niet" means "niet." Ukraine is the reddest of red lines. So this has been circling for a long time. Just wondered whether he's aware of John Mearsheimer's thoughts and what he thinks of them.
Yeah, so I think so. I mean, I think, I don't want to sound like Vladimir Putin, but this goes back to 895. This goes back to the Dark Ages. To go back to just what, one really, visual sort of, Narva, the eastern flank. 2 castles face each other across that river. One of them was built by the Danes, who are basically descendants of the Vikings, and the other one was built by Ivan the Great in 1492. So that has been the border between sort of Germanic, Danish, civilization and the Russians going back 1,000 or so years. Different populations on different sides of that border have been sort of nudging up against each other. I think, the hard line for NATO, I think, is, it's a club of democracies that agree to defend each other. And Ukraine, which wasn't allowed into that club, has decided to defend itself and is currently fighting on the battlefield to have the right to do that. And whatever we think about that, that is just the sort of realities of realpolitik in the 21st century. Lots of history going on, and people will be reading about this in 1,000 years' time.
Rishi in Longhurst says, "This is the most fascinating bit of radio I've heard all week. Well done, Ian and Peter." I think well done, Peter, is what you really meant to say there. It has been fascinating. Thank you so much for coming in. Wish you all the luck in the world with the book, because it really deserves to do well. It's called Deterring Armageddon, a Biography of NATO by Peter Apps. Thank you very much indeed, Peter.
Thank you.
Now, coming up in the next hour, this is one of those awkward gear change moments where we've been talking about defence policy, and we're now going to talk about the menopause. I've often wondered why the menopause is called the menopause. Maybe someone can enlighten us about that. The reason we're talking about it is because employers could be sued for disability discrimination if they fail to make reasonable adjustments for menopausal women, such as allowing them to work from home or lowering the temperature in the office. That's according to the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Have they got a point? If you are a menopausal woman, do you sort of issue a silent cheer when you hear things like that? How has the menopause affected you or your family?
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom at 9 o'clock, Rishi Sunak says the chaos which unfolded in the House of Commons last night was very concerning. Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle sparked fury by going against long-standing convention and allowing MPs to debate 3 proposals on a Gaza ceasefire. It had been tabled by the SNP.
The usual ways in which Parliament works were changed. Now, my understanding is that the Speaker has apologised for what happened and is reflecting on that. But I think the important point here is that we should never let extremists intimidate us into changing the way in which Parliament works.
More than 60 MPs have signed a motion of no confidence in Sir Lindsay. He says he's not only guilty of looking after MPs. Alexei Navalny's mother claims Russian officials are pressuring her into holding a secret funeral for the opposition leader. The Putin critics team says his death certificate cites natural causes, with Moscow denying any involvement. The Scouts have been referred to police as an inquest finds a teenager who fell 200 feet on a trip in North Wales was unlawfully killed. The organisation is to be investigated for conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Europol says it's dismantled one of the most active networks involved in smuggling migrants across the English Channel in small boats. An operation involving authorities from Belgium, France and Germany has led to 19 arrests. A minister says resolving the post office scandal by ensuring that all victims are fairly compensated will see workers who are actually guilty also exonerated. But Kevin Hollinrake says it is a price worth paying. And wheelchair racers at the London Marathon are to get the same prize money as able-bodied athletes. The winners of all of April's races stand to earn about £43,000. British Paralympian David Weir has won the event 8 times. He told LBC it is a huge moment for equality.
When I first won that race, I didn't think we would get to this point now. So I think it's a massive achievement with London Marathon. I'm glad London Marathon has done it because it's where my heart is and it's where I started. It's where I first saw wheelchair athletes.
In the city, the FTSE 100 closed up 22 points at 76.84. The pound buys $1.27 and €1.17.
LBC Weather.
With Ripple Energy. Part own a wind farm and take control of your energy.
Scattered showers in the north and west tonight. Snow possible on the hills in Wales, northwest England and Scotland, and a low of -1. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Daryl Jackson.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with Iain Dale.
Four minutes past 9 on LBC. If you've only just tuned in and you missed that last hour, you might want to listen back on Catch Up or watch it on Global Player or the